everybody for joining today's roundtable. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, not just to open the dialogue around the very quickly changing face of online trust and safety, but I guess to really get under the hood of what defines internet safety at this turn of the decade. So we have the very best minds to do that with a collaboration between Concentrix and Kinzen. From Kinzen, I'm joined by CEO Mark Little and Head of Partnerships Lucy Gold, both leading forward the Kinzen mission to protect online communities and public dialogue from disinformation and false and harmful content, which Kinzen does via your expert network, I guess, that allows for early line of sight of harmful content, of the risks across all the major platforms. And it's alerting on trends, on hashtags, on the dog whistles, everything that can quickly escalate online via text, video, and audio content. Now, from Concentrix, we share the experience from the content moderation perspective. So we have over 12,500 trust and safety colleagues all over the world, and a growing intelligence and social listening and analysis practice that is overseen by my very esteemed colleague with me today, James Lewandon. Now, I know we do have a lot to talk about today, but I wanted to add a little bit of context as to why this topic is really so important, and the reality that we all see in our daily roles as a result of this hyperscale surge in online activity. As more and more platforms are emerging, user-generated content just continues to build and build. And now we're all taking very early steps towards a metaverse and how that is going to evolve. Indeed, the expected size of global content moderation solutions is already twice what it was estimated to be last year. And it's projected to reach an incredible 13.6 billion in the next 5 years. So I guess just put really simply, more moderation and more solutions and intervention is needed, because the problem is just much bigger than it used to be. And it's not just an issue of videos or acts of violence online. We're now talking about disinformation campaigns, advanced types of fraud, identity theft, misuse of gaming, misuse of e-commerce platforms, and the list goes on and on. And in fact, there's new ways to create harm online almost daily, and trust and safety issues are really gaining more focus than ever from users, from governments, also from activists and the platforms themselves, of course. Mark, that it's the very crux of what led to Kinzen. So at the core of risk of online activity is that spread of false information. What do you think's changed in most recent times to spur the rise of dis and misinformation?
Well, Paula, I'm old enough to remember, like 30 years ago, believe it or not, I started out as a journalist, right? And in those days, quality information came at you from the newspaper, from television, from radio. You knew exactly who was doing the editing. You knew the source. You could check that that person was saying something that was true or not. And then suddenly social media arrived, and it was a liberation in one way. I was a TV journalist, and I was a better journalist because I was listening to people coming to me as I was doing my anchorman job at the time. And they were giving me questions for, political interviews. So I really loved Twitter. It was a liberation. At the dark side of it was, I remember being at a wedding where Michael Jackson's death was known by the people at the wedding before the local newspaper reported it. That was back in 2009. So that combination of this liberation where we could all talk to each other, free from interference and editing, but at the same time, when you could talk to each other, who do you trust? And that was the beginning. And I saw with the formation of a company called Storyful during the early part of the Arab Spring, if you remember, before the conflict in Syria, where we started to see this, the first wave of online disinformation that at the beginning was very political, right? It was dealing with issues that were way beyond people's normal everyday life. But since then, since that very political beginning of online threat, misinformation, hate speech, we've started to see it seeping into different aspects of people's lives to the point today where it can affect your health, your decisions about investing, just even trusting who to review, believe reviews. And I think that's what's happened over the past 10 years is something that used to be a problem in a distant part of the internet is now something that is kind of all around us like a cloud.
And it's interesting, you and I have talked before, and we've talked about how this kind of information online is almost like a weapon. It can have such massive impact on people. It can spur on big events. What's the scale of harm in that area? What do you think it can actually lead to? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so we're seeing it breaking down in various pieces because obviously what's happening is people, as you say, are using the internet as a weapon. They've worked out that the internet is powered by algorithms, right? And generally on advertising platforms or places where, the platforms have a vested interest in showing people the content that makes the most emotional, right? Makes them either outraged or happy or sad. And what a lot of these people, these dark or threat actors, as we might call them, have decided they realize virality is a great way of spreading messages beyond anybody's control. So in the old days, we had freedom of speech, which we still should protect. But what's happened is these platforms have given these people who are, disinformation spreaders or people who just want to, manipulate our conversations, an ability to pull us down these rabbit holes. So the way the internet is organized right now, because of these algorithms, that allows these people to come in. And I'll give you a few examples. Like I see it as sort of 4 or 5 layers of false information that is real world harm. The first is, political actors, as I've mentioned already. Believe it or not, there's 81 governments at last count were using disinformation to impact elections and people's opinions. Then we have the kind of misinformation. That's sort of the viral stuff where your uncle sends you the video, telling you that this is the cure for COVID. It's not necessarily intentional, but just kind of spreads through communities. And then I think what we see another more dangerous threat is a lot of conspiracy theorists. These are people on the fringe are using, innocuous conversations about things like fitness to spread really crazy and dangerous ideas about the world. And then we see a whole bunch of other very, very sinister threats from hate groups, who are spreading racism, through sporting conversations. And finally, we see a lot of people that are financially motivated to pull the wool over our eyes. So for example, just recently, the FTC said that online fraud in areas like cryptocurrency and scam reviews is now responsible for more than a third of all online fraud is coming from this form of misinformation. So it comes in many different types. Some of it's about just debate and dissent and people saying crazy things in the internet. We don't worry about that. It's where it actually has a real world harm in our lives and now so many aspects of it.
And it is fairly rife. It's coming, as you say, from so many different channels. And some of it is so subtle. That's where the users then online just not really appreciating the harm and danger there is behind it. But I guess, what's being done about it? What's happening or missing from government and the platform owners in order to help to control this and diffuse this?
I think one of the benefits, and Lucy can talk about this in a moment, we work with, I think, content moderators and also then the technology companies, the trust and safety teams who are there. And I think have got an increasingly sophisticated understanding of the things they have to do. It's not all about taking down content, right? In some cases, we work with technology companies to push forward the quality content quicker. We can spot if it's what we call information gaps, where something's just happened with a new vaccine. And immediately the people that want to spread misinformation exploit that. So we're helping technology companies push better information to people, sometimes not give some of this misinformation, the virality, and obviously in certain cases, taking content down. What I'm excited by is in Europe this year, we'll have the first real global standards around mis and disinformation. So we have the Digital Services Act, that's going to address the sort of the illegal, harmful content. I think that's going to include a lot of the scams that we see on the internet, the fraud. And then there's a code of practice that all the platforms are signing up to, which should come around April or May of this year, that will start saying, here's what the technology companies have to do, like give users more empowerment. So like, I think the future is a bit more like food, right? Where we walk into a supermarket, we know exactly what's in that piece of food that we're buying, how it's packaged, where it came from. And so I think the future I'm seeing more and more is technology companies realizing that not only have they got to fight back against mis and disinformation and hate speech, they got to give users the power to spot the difference when they're in that conversation and they're trying to work out who is here to try and manipulate me. So I think that's what has to be done. But to be honest, it's not moving fast enough. And another danger, which we got to watch out for, is sometimes we have these online harm bills that are just a means of censoring debate. So we have to be really mindful that we don't just have a blanket ban on things that make us feel uncomfortable. We got to find some way at separating crazy things at the internet or things we don't agree with from things that are harmful. And that's what we do at Kinsen, is help people be more precise and fast in getting the right response which is not always taking the content down. Sometimes it's being ahead of it and listening more to your customers, your clients, your citizens, your voters. That's kind of partly, I think, what is so exciting about this conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important leading towards that new Digital Service Act, and I guess you and Lucy as an organisation at Kinsen, you're providing counsel towards that and inputs and kind of points of view as some of that evolves. But Lucy, you're also providing counsel and content to organisations like us, like Concentrix and the big tech platforms and social media platforms who are involved in trying to control it, even at the content moderation side. What challenges do you see facing that trust and safety capability, those teams in the current climate?
Yeah, as you say, we work with trust and safety professionals every single day. We've also conducted some research talking to the practitioners, the folks who are either creating policy or enforcing policies, to really understand their goals. I think what's clear is this is a really new discipline, as we've already said, but it's under huge microscopes. So they're growing up under a spotlight. This is a massive focus of attention for most organizations, and yet they're still in their infancy. So the stakes are high for these folks. I think the main challenges really are, organizational, getting alignment with internal stakeholders. Most people who work in trust and safety and content moderation are also doing an education job to their internal stakeholders as well, which can hold up processes. The teams are often operating in organizations that priorities are not aligned with this work. So that is obviously an ongoing challenge, and examples of where that manifests are really, instances of misapplication of policy, which can obviously lead to a lot of challenges. The people in these roles are really mission driven. They are really wanting to make a real life impact. There has a feeling of social justice, but often they feel like they're part of very small insurgent teams that I feel that they're lacking support. So there's obviously massive challenges organizationally. Part of that is also how they're measured. Measurement in trust and safety, I think, is really lacking or underdeveloped. Most organizations are still really not clear on how and what to measure. But they know it's important. They know it's important to justify resources, managing for quality. There's, vital feedback loops that the people doing the work could really benefit from. So I think measurement is obviously a real challenge for these organizations. And success for some seems to be good press coverage, and a fail is negative. And I think we have to really move forward on measurement side of it, and I think that these teams really feel the pain of the lack of measurement as it stands. I think they're also in a information void. There's a gap in insights, particularly on the evolving work. Things are changing every single day, so there's an absolute information gap, or it's an information overload. So there's a real bridge that needs to happen between the research community and the practitioners, really, to make insights digestible and actionable. There's almost too much information out there, or not enough. So that bridge really definitely is a pain point for these folks. And I think the insights really vary by market. We work in about 12 different markets at the moment, and we see that the information void in some more than others. So I think from an insights perspective, there's some real gaps. And obviously the one that we all know is scaling. That's the massive challenge. Scaling the coverage areas that have to be considered, scaling to these multi-markets, multiple languages, how to scale the insights, how to scale, machine learning can really help us with that, but it can't take care of the nuance in some of this decision making. Interpretation is everything, really. Innuendo, insinuation, sarcasm, cynicism. Those things are really hard to train machine learning models to understand. So really just, it's in an industry and it's really infancy at the earliest stages of development. And there is still so much that has to happen really on processes, policies and tools, really to keep the users safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bang on in terms of the challenges on the machine learning side. I mean, when the algorithms do their work, effectively you want less and less to be coming out for the human moderation kind of review, but that's getting bigger and bigger. But we've just completed another fascinating study, and it's interesting you talk about the measures and the quality and the training, and we've really looked deep from our clinical team at metacognitive load in the training environment of our employees working within trust and safety, and just taking into consideration the demographic that is that workforce, Gen Zers kind of working in this environment, and what is their kind of metacognitive load when they're in a training environment. And it is producing some incredibly interesting insights about how, as organizations, we got to rethink everything. We've grown up through businesses of supporting customers, and there's training processes, hiring processes, quality checks, all kinds of things for coaching and support. And actually, they need completely remodified, because there is a whole different approach to learning about you can be incredibly great critical thinker and take all of this information in, but actually some of this demographic is wanting to challenge those policies. They don't agree with them, and so you get into a space where bias becomes an issue unintentionally. So it's, there's a whole breadth of operational delivery that has to get redesigned as well, in and around just how all this is manifesting. James, let me come to you. You currently partner with some of the world's largest brands who truly understand the importance, I guess, of a robust social media strategy. So you're really on the social platform side. Does your experience see those trends and challenges that Lucy's talking about? Do you see those materializing daily in social media activity? And how easy is it, are you seeing, for things to kind of become viral and problematic?
Yeah, it's a good question, Paula. So I would say that it's never been a riskier time to be in social media, frankly. So if I think back to whenever I first entered this industry, would have been back in 2014. And around that time, Michael Schumacher, right, had a very unfortunate incident and has taken years to recover from. Now, back at that time, it was a really good learning experience for me, because what actually happened during that time was one single journalist made one single claim on Twitter that the cause for Schumacher's accident was the GoPro device that he was wearing on his head, right? Now, this was largely unsubstantiated. This hadn't been looked into. This had not been confirmed. But the point is, within 24 hours, GoPro share price had dropped 15%, right? So that's the impact of this type of activity on social media. It's massive. And since that point, I've been fascinated ever since. But I would really say, for a lot of reasons that are beginning to emerge, particularly across the last 18 months, that the stakes have never been higher. We've seen throughout COVID-19, right, the digital adoption, social media usage has jumped up, I think, around 50% on average. So more people are online, more people are spending greater lengths of time online, which I think averages to around 5 to 6 hours a day on social media, as if it wasn't enough before, right? So there's a lot more chance for someone to encounter misinformation, to see content that maybe hasn't been verified in the ways that Mark and Lucy are talking about. And that creates real risk. I think the influencer side of social media is a really interesting facet of this as well, because we've got massive influencers now. There's a new one every single day in pretty much every single industry. These people are elevated, put on a pedestal, right, as a somewhat bastion of truth for their followers and their audiences. But the simple truth remains that there just isn't legislation, laws, regulation to ensure that the content that these influencers put out is factual, right? They're not obligated to make sure that what they're talking about or what they're promoting or what they're paid to promote is actually true. And that's incredibly dangerous, right? So that really works towards, well, what do we have to do about this? Well, that's really where the world of social listening and monitoring does come in. Yes, social data can be hard to manage. There's a lot of it, right? There's hundreds of thousands of mentions of various brands out there, but technology does exist to bring that in, start crunching it, and really being on top of these threats as we see them. But short answer to your question, really the risk has never been higher on the social media side.
And Mark gave us some really great examples earlier where, big key events were leading to a series of widespread false information. things like the anti-vax campaigns, COVID misinformation, the US elections, even in the UK, the elections. And I think you and I have talked before where there was evidence on the recent elections in the UK of 90% of Facebook adverts being potentially false, really swaying public voting decisions. But we're also seeing the reverse, and I think this causes me most concern. We're also seeing the reverse, which it's where the false information spirals online to the point that it can result in social activism in the physical world, right? And you've seen that kind of spur through as you've done social listening as well.
That's absolutely right. So I think as misinformation begins to grow and more people are actively online, like I mentioned, social activism is really beginning to pick up, right? And it's really beginning to emerge. I think the simple truth now is that pretty much any brand in the world is open to risk when it comes to this type of social action that we're talking about. So to give a recent example of what we've seen, take Kellogg's, the brand Kellogg's, for example. Now, very recently, they had around 1,500 workers who went on strike, I believe in the USA, over pay conditions and the contracts they had with the company. Now, in fairness to Kellogg's, they did open negotiations, they tried to put this right. But what began to happen at this stage was very interesting, right? Because some of this press coverage was put onto Twitter, right, as to what was going on. And the narrative shifted very quickly, right? Online personalities and different users began to read between the lines, come up with their own conclusions, right? And very quickly, concerted action from Kellogg's to actually do right by their workforce actually became a popular narrative that they're practicing union busting, right? They're trying to deny these workers their rights, they're trying to lay them off. And then very unfortunately for Kellogg's, they began a hiring drive at roughly the same time, simply to get production back to where it had to be. But the point is, all these good efforts that Kellogg's were putting in, it became totally out of their hands on the social realm. This news began to trickle to Reddit. It began to further inflate and expand, and different interpretations were applied to these messages. And very quickly, this became concerted social action, right? We had a group of people on Reddit actively flooding Kellogg's job site, their application process, with thousands of bogus applications. And this actually brought the website down. It crashed the Kellogg's website, and their HR team were simply unable to cope. And this had real impact, right? Because they couldn't further production, they couldn't get supply back to where it had to be, simply because of this social action. So it really goes to show that even someone like Kellogg's, they're very much in the firing line and for this potential amount of risk on social. And to my previous point, it goes to show that simply one loose claim on social media, whether it's on Twitter, Reddit, wherever it might be posted, the snowball effect that can have a very tangible impact on even the share price of a brand. So it's never been more important to be very hyper aware of what's being said about your brand online and having the means to understand the current narrative. Because if you're not part of the discussion, it's taken out of your hands by social users.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that. I mean, we're seeing absolutely that kind of really deep analytical, processes and service that you provide through social listening really gaining more momentum. So there's clearly steps that brands can take as countermeasures when these kind of disinformation campaigns are used against them. Mark, are you seeing other trends surface on your side as well, at the types of data that you see and digest that you produce?
I think we're starting to see an evolution of attitudes as well to the moment at which you need to intervene, whether you're a brand or you're someone who's supplying information, quality information. So, for example, we worked with health authorities, where what we're doing is saying to them is there's a missing piece here. You've got to distinguish between a concern about something that's just happened or some rumor someone's just heard, and active disinformation campaigns, people trying to hijack or manipulate the community you care about or trying to protect. And being able to spot that difference, I think, is absolutely vital. Where there is a missing piece of information that you need to go in and supply about something that's just happened, or an interpretation of the conversation that's happening, you got to move in and supply that. So listen carefully to the people who are expressing legitimate concerns and give them the information that is going to meet their need, but then very clearly separate that legitimate question from organized behavior, what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior is the kind of phrase that's now become common for those of us who are actively looking at the activities of these networks. And so I think in that case, you have to think a lot about behavior, almost more than content. Because here's one thing I think a mistake that's made is that people are listening, or they're just looking at the content, and they're looking out for content that's wrong or that's misinformed. Sometimes the most powerful content is actually true, but it's just being manipulated by a network of people. So what I would say is ABC. It's about action and behavior as well as content. In other words, I mean, try and spot the bot networks. There's lots of different terms we'll use. I won't throw them at you right now, but lots of terms where we can track and see where some small network is trying to pretend that there's a grassroots campaign called astroturfing, or where they've hijacked accounts and they're bombarding a particular target with this inauthentic behavior. So behavior counts, I would argue, in certain cases more than content sometimes. So it's not just enough to listen. You've got to watch as well and hopefully spot the inauthentic behavior. And again, separate the legitimate concern of the people you care about, protecting them, from the inauthentic behavior of people that are just trying to manipulate the conversation in ways that are kind of underhand and hidden to your community. So that's a vital distinction that I think we're seeing more of, particularly from the health campaigns where we've been involved. And for example, we've had situations where a health authority in Ireland, we just told them there's a rumor going around about the impact of vaccines on women's fertility, and they could respond immediately with the correct information to fill that gap where that rumor had begun. And we could then see a drop in the spike in conversations about that false rumor. So, a lot of this, I think the analogy with as we call it, the infodemic, we're watching out for those super spreaders who are trying to spread the virus of disinformation by this inauthentic behavior that's a mark of those disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common theme through everything that we've all talked about today is just that power of insights and being able to look around corners, as Lucy and I keep saying. I don't think we can stop the false information. We can't stop it from starting, but the earlier the visibility means that we can be prepared. We can be prepared for policy changes, for the training, for the quality pieces that Lucy spoke about earlier. And I think obviously understanding just the true scale of demand so that we can intercept it a little bit more effectively. So I think just wrapping up on today, the idea of forewarned is forearmed. Your one key must-have working in this field of online information. James, I'm going to start with you. What would the one killer thing be for you?
Yeah, so I think the model that Mark spoke about, the ABC model, is very appropriate, right? Because I think the one pitfall that I would see typically when it comes to social listening and analysis is brands will use social data to push product level and brand level enhancement, right? They're not using it in a way that tackles all of the challenges and all of the threats that we've thrown about today. So I think that's number one. And I think to really achieve that, to become a bit more ahead of the game, it's really looking at social listening and social analysis through a slightly different lens, right? It's taking that social data in. Fantastic if it can drive product enhancement and brand improvement, that's great. But there's a lot of information that can be gleaned between the lines as well, right? So for me, it's tracking that data in, applying real-time analysis to make sure that you're cognizant of any emerging threats, any emerging trends, any sudden shifts in the narrative, because that might not just be because of your brand or its products. It could be something slightly more unsavory that's happening between the lines. And the only way to track that is to really become a lot more conversational with the discussion and the social chatter around your brand. And then I think from that point on, if you can get on top of that, it's applying an early warning system, right? Taking the right approach to flag not just the product concerns that I talked about, but any emerging, reputational threats that, fall into that mis or disinformation camp, because they can be surfaced on social media. The key point for me is if you can understand what's happening around your brand, it puts you in the beautiful position of being able to jump into that narrative, right? To actually educate your customer base, set disinformation straight, get the facts out there and become part of that discussion. Because like I said earlier on, if you're not part of that discussion, then you're really playing with fire, because imaginations can run wild very, very quickly when it comes to social media.
I mean, Lucy, I imagine you concur with that 10 times over. Anything else you want to add as we wrap on that whole theme?
Yeah, I think obviously spotting that information gap, filling that information gap, but making sure there's that human element in the loop. so that all decisioning is informed by expertise, and getting that into the hands of the people making the decisions, either on enforcement or policy, to really help inform that ongoing work, I think, is the speed to which that information and those insights, those quality data, that quality insight is provided to teams, I think, is the key.
Yeah, I think first of all is don't get wedded to one particular platform. Like, you may love Instagram, you may love Twitter as a brand or an organization, but conversations are beginning elsewhere. So you need to have full cross-platform awareness of where the conversations, and sometimes the most intense, fervent conversations about your brand, your organization, your community will happen somewhere you didn't know about. So be aware of that. I think also learn to speak the language of those who would spread conspiracies or false information, through hashtags that are developing, to understand exactly what are the dog whistles, the kind of language that when you look at it doesn't seem too active or too powerful to you, but to a group of people, it's like a signal for them to act and to engage. I think finally, one of the interesting things I've seen is, remember what you're trying to give to your community that you care about. They're overwhelmed with information. They want someone to help them make sense of it. They're not looking necessarily for more truth. They're looking for trust. And so therefore, I would see the people within your community who are the influencers, who I call the curators. These are the people that, just because they care about the subject you care about, are actively sorting out the information for people every single day. Again, influencers are one example of that, in communities where people look to them to sort out the right from the wrong, or the information they should trust. So find the curators in your community, engage with them, help them, and treasure them. And we've seen examples. I'll give you one example. QAnon, you may have heard of this hyper-partisan conspiracy theories out of the US, tried to hijack yoga influencers last year. And the influencers stood up and said no, and have pushed back against what we call the conspirituality movement. And again, that wasn't brands or governments or platforms. That was people who cared about other people in the community. So find those people, treasure them, nourish them, because in the end of the day, they're the people that people really trust in the community, even if they don't necessarily always trust you as the organization or brand.
Mark, thank you really much for that. I think ending on this positive note about the vital role that communities play and the importance of, who we as consumers and the public wanting to do the right thing is probably the optimism of good citizenship that we need to think about when we're speaking about all of this disinformation. So there is an undoubted, very changing landscape ahead of us as we continue to navigate this space. It's great partnering with the likes of you and Lucy at Kinsen, and James, thank you very much for all of your inputs from the social space as well. But I think that's a wrap for our discussion today, and thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking again in the future.
Thanks, Paula.
Okay.